All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. If you are new here, we are primarily an interview and a commentary-based podcast. My name is Billy Dees. We have an interview for you today. On the studio line with me, I have Wendy Correa. Wendy, it is such a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here in conversation with you today.
It's great to have you. Interesting. You encompass a lot of things that people are interested in. For one thing, the idea of trauma is a big topic now. People are becoming more understanding of that. And you have a showbiz connection, which everybody seems to be intrigued with at one point or another. So we got a lot to talk about. Let me tell you a little bit about Wendy. She, like I said, she is an industry insider, a radio DJ. That's kind of getting into my territory there. Awesome. And now an author. In her new book, My Pretty Baby, she writes about her own riveting journey with ACE, which stands for Adverse Childhood Experience. She also includes her time in celebrity circles, spiritual practices, and a lifetime of healing from childhood trauma. The book is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and an urgent reminder that healing requires honesty, community, and hope. An interesting statistic here, approximately 64% of adults in the United States have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, which we refer to as ACE, before the age of 18, and nearly 1 in 6 people report experiencing 4 or more, according to the CDC. This author is on a mission to destigmatize and educate about ACE and the effect on mental health in her new book. Is that fair? That's a fair description of what's going on with you?
That is a great description. Thank you.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about stigma first before we get into anything else, because we talked a little bit in our pre-production conversation, and I'm from Ohio. And Ohio has been one of the areas that's worst in the entire country for addiction of one kind or another. And mental health issues often intersect with addiction, and mental health is often impacted by trauma. And childhood trauma is probably at the top of the list for that. This is especially true of heroin here again in our state. One of the things that really prevents people from getting help is that they are going to be perceived as someone who, the terrible term is crazy. We don't use that, but that's what they think about. The other thing is they don't want to be perceived as a victim. They don't want to let things out about what happened in their own family. A lot of times when it comes to childhood abuse. And what this does, for our area, for example, there's a lot of nonprofits. There's a lot of community agencies that rely on funding. A lot of time things come up for a vote, and the public doesn't understand these things, and they don't make the proper judgments. So this is all because of stigma. Would you like to talk a little bit about stigma first when it comes to mental health, childhood trauma, anything under that umbrella?
Absolutely. And we are making strides. We are taking, baby steps forward. My mother, bless her heart, who was born in 1918, you would say to me, Wendy, when I was coming up, we didn't have Oprah. And that is true. It's only been, since Oprah has wanted to talk openly and honestly, without guilt, without shame, to break down the stigma. And I think really she did open a door, and she has a fabulous book now with Bruce Perry called What Happened to You, which explains to people how their trauma rewires their brains. And more research is coming out to help us understand how childhood trauma, and beyond that, how trauma in general affects and rewires our biology and how it affects us for life. And as I was writing my book, actually, I had begun writing the book long before I really knew these things. I have a degree in psychology, but the most recent the most recent studies by the likes of Gabor Mate and Nadine Burke-Harris and Bessel van der Kolk have only come out in the last 10 years. So as I was writing my book, I was also studying all of these books, and I saw myself on every page, and it made me feel less alone, and that it made me realize I'm not crazy,
Mhm.
that it genuinely does rewire the brain. It affects the central nervous system, the immune system, and now research has proven it and continues to prove it. And so this book that I wrote, as I was writing it, I realized this is not just my story. This is everyone's story. And this is my call to action for you and I, Billy, to have these conversations, for everyone to start having these conversations about how their childhood or intergenerational trauma may have affected them. You know, in lots of communities, in the African American community, in the immigrant community, people did not want to talk about the hardships and the challenges that they faced because they couldn't. In order to survive, they just had to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And they didn't want to burden their children with that. So they buried a lot of this intergenerational trauma. But as you know, Gabor Mate says trauma isn't just an external event, it's what happens inside of us. The stress literally changes the brain and the body, and especially the central nervous system, as I said, and the immune system. It doesn't just disappear, it hides in the nervous system, and it will come out in other ways, whether that be trying to cover up the pain with substance abuse, gambling, or any other addiction, shopping. There's so many, or with rage, and but also chronic illnesses like irritable bowel and heart disease. And as Bessel van der Kolk puts it, the body keeps the score. So, having said all that, my call to action is my book is a guidebook for anyone who may want to begin to start healing and to help them find a way to start to take those steps and to start to remove some of the shame that they may feel about wanting to talk about intergenerational and childhood trauma.
Yeah. Again, the book is called My Pretty Baby, Seeking Truth and Finding Healing. I'll just touch on one thing that you said there. So often, mental health issues, trauma, people will become inclined to become addicted to various substances because they are self-medicating. And one of the stigmas that we try to fight here in Ohio is that people made a choice. It's when you hear people talk about it, it's like they just got up one morning and said, "You know what? I'm going to get addicted to drugs today. I don't care." It just doesn't happen that way. Now, I'm not saying that irresponsible behavior is not a component of this. Of course it is, but that isn't the path to addiction here in Ohio. Even if you haven't been traumatized, even if you're not fighting a mental health issue, typically addiction creeps up on you. It's just like you don't get overweight overnight. And I think we all have had a hard day at work and we've said, boy, I sure could use a cigarette, or boy, I sure could use a beer, or whatever. And most of the time it passes without incident. But there's other times when the steps have begun. And just as you were saying, Wendy, over time, 6 months, a year in of making those adjustments in what you're putting into your body to feel better changes patterns in your brain. And at that point, it's very hard not to turn that ship around without help. So I'm glad we had a chance to speak about stigma, if you want to follow up with that.
Absolutely. So, the good news is, though, as I always say, trauma is universal. And so what I'd like to say about the ACE study, that why it's so important, as you said, the statistics are that millions of us have some form of trauma, and it could come in many different ways, whether it's poverty or child abuse or substance abuse in the home or violence, domestic violence, neglect. I mean, there's many ways of a child to experience trauma, the death of a parent, divorce. So chances are, as you said, 64% of adults have at least one ACE. And what I sometimes people would say, well, um, why should people think about childhood trauma if they don't think it affects them? And my answer is because it does affect them. The impact of trauma is a public health issue affecting our communities in many ways. And if 64% of adults have at least one ACE, that could be your spouse, your friend, your coworker, your boss, your neighbors. Someone you know has experienced adverse childhood experiences, and that childhood trauma costs society billions of dollars every year in healthcare and lost productivity, in addiction, mental illness, and incarceration. But even more than that, it shapes how we parent, how we love, how we live. And so that's why this story isn't just my story, it's literally everyone's.
Yes. Let's talk about you a little bit. You are currently in Colorado, is that correct?
In Denver, yes.
In Denver, yes. Now, where were you from originally?
Originally from the Midwest, from Illinois.
Okay. Now, somewhere along the line, you got crossed with some celebrities. I'll drop a couple names here for you. Ringo Starr is one of them. Joni Mitchell. By the way, Joni Mitchell, her version of Both Sides Now, I think is fantastic. I think it's better than the pop version that you're used to hearing. I
Right?
just it's a fantastic version, and probably for people who really like to read, Hunter S. Thompson. And that writer's probably, I'm going to say, best known for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. How were you always drawn to performances, art, that type of thing? Is that how you got involved with so many heavy hitters in that regard?
Well, I would say growing up in Illinois, I didn't have a lot of respite or a lot of outlets except for listening to WLS out of Chicago and listening to Motown music out of Detroit. That music saved me. And I always say that music raised me. And I always wanted to be connected somehow with the music industry. But I left home. I got myself in college and went to college in Northern California. And when I went to Los Angeles, I had a really good friend who was an artist, and he took me to his friends' houses. He was a famous artist. You would recognize Boyd Elder's art, like on the cover of the greatest hits of the Eagles. He
Oh,
did the
okay.
skulls. And he often took me to his friends' houses. I went to Stephen Still's house and other people's houses. And one day he took me to Joni Mitchell's house. And of course, I didn't know that that's where I was going, but I was lucky enough that I had quite a few um, more times that I hung out with Joni. And the reason that I write about her and is because she was so kind to me and she was so generous with me and she reflected back to me my self-worth. And the point was that I had this rough childhood and did not feel like I belonged in my family, and I didn't really feel loved by my family. And so for Joni Mitchell to spend time with me and to engage with me, and we talked like we were sisters. We talked about hairstyles and if we were ever going to quit smoking. And she was just a kindred spirit who spoke to me like an equal. And of course, it blew my mind because I was just, I wasn't famous, and so I wondered why she liked me so much. And so that's why I talk about the time that I spent with Joni, because she reflected back to me that I was lovable and that I deserved to be loved and that I had, gifts to offer the world. And I write about the time that I met Ringo because um, in Los Angeles, when I was working in the music industry, I was hanging out on Sunset Strip at Sushi on Sunset with a band, and attempted to drive home and was arrested and thrown in jail for a DUI. And I was given court ordered AA meetings. And so the very first meeting that I went to in West LA, I walked in and this gentleman came walking up to me, extending his hand with this big wide smile and said, "Hello, my name is Richard." And my head exploded. And I said, "Well, in my head, I said, oh
Mm-hmm.
my God, your name might be Richard, but it's also Ringo."
Mm-hmm.
And, then his wife, his lovely wife, Barbara Bach, came up and shook my hand. And that was it. I mean, that was literally it. I sat in my very first AA meeting, stunned, and sat there thinking, if Ringo Starr can get sober, then I can too, with all the things that, he's surrounded by. And for such a international, I mean, there's nobody bigger than the Beatles to me. For him to be at an AA meeting, being of service so that he can stay sober by greeting newcomers, just blew my mind.
Yeah.
And so again, his kindness, and I tell those stories because you never know how you, as a person being kind to another person, how that might impact them for life,
Yeah.
and how that a short encounter might really, really make a difference. And so I got sober in Los Angeles in the music industry and went to many AA meetings with lots of people in the music industry and other actors and writers and celebrities. And by the time I left Los Angeles to go to Aspen, Colorado, I got a job as a DJ on KSPN FM, Roaring Fork Radio. And the program manager, my boss, told me, first asked me, "Do you know who Hunter S. Thompson is?" And I said, "Yeah, I've read articles of his in Rolling Stone magazine."
Yeah.
And he said, "Well, he'll probably be calling you in the middle of the night." And sure enough, my first week, one morning of course, because I was the newbie, I had the 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. time slot. And at 4 a.m., I get the call. Yeah, can you play me some Warren Zevon, Lawyers, Guns, and Money? And, hi, Hunter. And I played Warren Zevon for Hunter for many, many more times. And then a few weeks later, actually living in Aspen, you had to have about 10 jobs to live there. So I was also waitressing, and he came into my restaurant, and, I served him lunch and told him I was also his DJ. And
Mm-hmm.
by the end of his lunch, he told me that he needed an assistant and was I interested in the job, which of course I was. And by that time, I was already sober. I had already quit drinking and smoking and doing the drugs, the LA drugs. And I didn't like guns. I didn't know really anything about sports or politics. And so we were really an interesting pair working together. It was just a professional relationship, not a romantic one. But
Yeah.
even still, I couldn't stay up all night like he did. I had to go home and go to sleep at night. And he knew that I was sober. Of course, he still continued to do all the things that he did. Um, but he never, pressured me or asked me if I wanted any of the substances that he was using, except for one time he said, "Yeah, hey, you want to go blow something up?" I was like, "No, thank you, Hunter. I don't want to shoot any guns with you." But again, the reason that I tell the story is because in spite of his notorious reputation and in spite of the substances that he did, he was a very kind and generous person. And the same, he reflected to me my value and my self-worth. And it was part of my healing to have people in such outer space, orbits in the world to be so kind towards me and to reflect back to me that I was lovable. And Hunter was always that way with me, in spite of his very gruff and opinionated and outspoken exterior. I saw a gentleness. I saw through that armor, and
Hmm.
we connected in a very deep way. And when I left Aspen, I always thought that I would see him again. And of course, I'm very sad to know that I won't.
Yeah. When I talk to people who have been on some sort of a journey like you have been, oftentimes it unfolds in a way that's very similar to this. They go on with their life. They are seemingly very happy. And then the problems with addiction starts and they're in denial for a while. And one thing or another happens and they realize this can't continue. How did that happen for you? When did you realize this isn't right? And how did that evolve into going back through your past and figuring out how you got to that point to begin with?
Well, I would, the first time I got drunk, I was 10 years old. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I lived in a home where I didn't feel safe. I had an alcoholic stepfather who was violent. My father had died when I was 7. And, at a sleepover of 10-year-old girls, we got into the liquor cabinet because I was curious, why does my stepdad, drink?
Yeah.
And when I got drunk at 10 years old and felt numb, and it was the first time I felt like I had relaxed in a long time. And I went on to do all the drugs that were available to me. I was like a little kid of the 60s and
Mm-hmm.
smoked and drank, and I dropped acid and, tried a lot of drugs. And when I moved to California, I also tried plant medicine, psilocybin, which was actually more of a very spiritual drug for me. But there was also Humboldt homegrown. And by the time I moved to Los Angeles, of course, then I added cocaine to the mix.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also getting a master's degree in clinical psychology and working with methadone patients, people that were, trying to get off of heroin. And I was doing art therapy with them. And I was then going home and snorting cocaine to write my papers. And so I was working on a master's in clinical psych, and in order at Antioch University, and in order to be in the program, you also had to go through therapy. And I remember at one point, my therapist looked at me and she said, "Are you abusing any drugs?" And I was like, "Oh no, I just, snort cocaine when I want to write a paper." And she's like, "Wendy, any use is abuse."
Mm-hmm.
And it made me feel horrible. I hated it. I didn't like the way that it felt. And in my book, I outline I had a boyfriend who was a singer songwriter, and we would snort cocaine all night and sleep all day. And I'd barely make it to my evening classes. And I was just disgusted with myself. And I was, sick and tired of being sick and tired, as they say. I
Yeah.
felt horrible. I wasn't eating right. Um, and so, I it was easy to let go of cocaine because it made me feel terrible, and it
Yeah.
was easier to let go of pot. Um, and then, as I told you, you mean the miracle that happened was that I was arrested for a DUI, and so that was really my wake up call that this is really affecting my life, and I had to get sober. And then it took me another 5 years before I was able to let go of nicotine.
Mm-hmm.
And that one really brought me to my knees, is letting go of the nicotine. But It was a struggle. It was, healing is not a linear boom, boom, boom. And you can take, it isn't a straight line. Sometimes it's two steps forward and one step back. And I was always looking for wholesomeness. I wanted just to be whole and happy. And I wanted to be surrounded by good people. And I wanted to be the best version of myself. But I would slip into patterns, and even after I got arrested, I was sober for about a year, and I wound up going to a BMI ASCAP awards party. I had been sober for a year, and there was 10 bottles of wine on the table, and I told myself that big fat lie of like, well, I'm just a normal person. I've proven I don't need to drink. I just want to have a glass of wine. And, one glass turned into two, turned into three. I can't remember. I just remember waking up the next morning and I was still drunk. And so I immediately went to an AA meeting and started the clock all over again.
That's interesting that you knew how to reach out for help. So you're in your case, AA was very fundamental in learning the skills that you needed to. And by the way, alcohol is, people don't think about it in terms of cocaine and things, but it's actually one of the more dangerous drugs to withdraw from. It can be fatal if you don't do it right. So I would always encourage people to reach out and get help at an organization like that. Is that how you feel?
Absolutely. I think it's, one of the best programs that we have out there. And, there's lots of little splinter groups that have evolved over the years, and people have issues with certain philosophies or certain wording, for instance. And I say, take the good and leave the rest. The reason that it works is because of the community, because there are people there to support you, and a very strong, one day at a time. And I really got that in quitting smoking. You know how they say, oh yeah, I can quit smoking, I've done it a million times.
Yeah.
And at the point where I quit smoking, I had already quit a million times. And it was funny because I'm an agnostic and a Buddhist, really. If I had to say anything, or if I had to choose anything. But I wound up finding this quit smoking program at a Seventh Day Adventist church, and the minister, there was no proselytizing whatsoever. His whole goal was just to help you quit smoking one day at a time. And his name was Rocky, and he was just a fabulous guy. And I made him my higher power, and he would show us, you know, films about how addiction works, how it affects the brain, how to break the addiction. And he would send us home with a gallon of water and a little lunch bag filled with like candy and gum and toothpicks and a list of things to do before you smoked a cigarette. But for some reason, that program worked for me. It had nothing to do with, joining a church or anything. The goal was just to quit smoking. So in that regard, all the 12-step programs, their goal is to help you to stop the substances and to stay sober. And so, if there's a few things that you don't like about it, then that's how life is. Just take the good.
Yes, you take the good, and quite frankly, you really have to promise yourself that this is a path that you need to go on. And it does require discipline. MAT programs, medical assisted treatment, those things I'm a believer in. They do work, but they're not a bed and breakfast. You still have to be disciplined to go through these programs and do what the counselors tell you. You mentioned taking two steps back and one forward, or did I get that backwards? But you know what I mean.
Two steps forward and one step back.
There we go. So many times people do relapse when it comes to addiction, or in common speak, one of the things you'll hear people say is fall off the wagon. And
Yes.
that can be very discouraging because you feel like I'm never going to conquer this, but it is part of the process. It is something that you do have to stay with. What would be some of your tips to staying sober once you've reached that plateau to where, okay, I'm good right now, I don't want to fall? How do you maintain a sober life?
Well, again, the community. Community is everything because well, especially alcoholism is a disease of isolation,
Mhm.
and we need to surround ourselves with good people. And if that's people in the program, or you may have to set boundaries with people, you may have to lose some friends, but you need to be around other people who have goals that they want to improve their lives. And you certainly don't want to be around people who are saying, "Oh, you're so boring, just have one beer," or whatever it may be. You used to be so fun. You really maybe have to make some big changes in
Yep.
your life, and you have to show up for yourself. I mean, this is for your life and for yourself. But I think the community is really key. As I outline in my book, it wasn't just AA. I was also in a spiritual community of Native American spirituality with Native teachers, and that community, doing Native American ceremonies, kept me sober. And then, I would go and do yoga, and there's the yoga community and the hiking community. And so, I used the whole village, as they say, it takes a
Yep.
village. I used the whole thing. And I would go to meditation retreats and everything at my disposal. I tried everything, anything and everything that would help me. I also was in psychotherapy. I had to go to therapy for quite a while to um, help me in my healing as well. So, it's like what works for you may not work for another person, but I would say start with a healthy community.
Yes. It's the old saying, it sounds like a cliche, but it is so true. People, places, and things.
Yes.
You got to stay with people that want success for themselves. They want success for you. Misery loves company. If you're around misery, they'll welcome you as well. So yeah, you don't want to do that. Here again, the book is called My Pretty Baby: Seeking Truth and Finding Healing. One more thing before we wrap things up. You talk a lot about spirituality, and there's a lot of things that's in this book between the showbiz and the trauma and the learning about recovery. There's so many aspects to this. You have a spiritual side to you that's pretty obvious. You talk about Native Americans and so forth. You mentioned Buddhism, and you also mentioned being an agnostic. And I find that intriguing because I find, in terms of religions, for lack of a better term, Buddhism is more like a philosophy, I might want to say.
Yeah.
It's more of a kind of a handbook of life, I guess. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Well, mostly it helps you to be present. It helps you to be in your body. And it helped me a lot to calm the monkey mind that when your biology is rewired and your brain is so frazzled, it's hard to think straight. And so, even just using the simple techniques of following the breath, inhaling deeply, and then exhaling completely, in one breath, you can lower your blood pressure just by following the breath. And so when you can get in touch with your higher power, your inner wisdom, your Buddha mind, you can be the person that you really want to be. And so that's what the practice really is to help people to be their best selves. And a lot of it has to do with healing the central nervous system
Mm-hmm.
through breath work and meditation. And that meditation does not have to be sitting on the floor in a lotus pose that's very uncomfortable, and your hips and your legs and your back hurts, you can do a walking meditation. You can breathe and meditate while you're washing the dishes or folding the laundry. It's really more about settling into your body and feeling your deepest wisdom inside of you and tapping into that calm and that peace so that you can love yourself, which you have to do before you can love others.
That is so true. Self-respect, self-love. Here again, it often gets said so much it becomes a cliche, but it gets said so much because it is so true. We're speaking to Wendy B. Correa, and the book is My Pretty Baby, Seeking Truth and Finding Healing. First of all, where can people find the book?
You can find the book wherever books are sold. So wherever you like to buy your books, whether it's your indie bookstore or bookshop or Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Simon & Schuster, that's where the book is available. And my audiobook will also be available as of tomorrow, exclusively on Audible. So, and you can also find me at wendybcorrea.com. And on Instagram is just Wendy B. Correa, and Facebook is Wendy Correa.
So the audiobook, I have to ask, did you voice it since you're the radio DJ?
Yes, I absolutely did. Yes.
That's a lot more difficult than what people think it is. I get offers every once in a while. And, when you think about it, as the audience hears this, to read a book, maybe take a week or two when you're just casually reading it whenever, to properly read the book, orally, to verbalize it, you have to read it several times. You have to be very familiar with it. And then you have to speak each paragraph perfectly. And if not, you're going to have to go back and edit it, or your producer is going to have to do it, or you're going to have to read it again. How long did it take you to do it?
It took me 15 hours. So I would go into the studio for 3 hours at a time. And so that was 5 days, but not 5 consecutive days. It was all broken up. Thank goodness, because it was physically and emotionally and mentally exhausting.
Yes.
And even after 3 hours of talking, my body was like, okay, that's enough talking.
Yes. And people don't, it's almost like acting. You can't just read a bunch of words. You have to, bring some feeling to it. And, when you're reading quotes, you have to speak them as they're being said. And yes, it's a very mental thing. So I have a lot of respect for you for doing that. That's a tough one. I'll say the author's name one more time, Wendy B. Correa. And My Pretty Baby is the name of the book, Seeking Truth and Finding Healing. Wendy, it's been a pleasure talking to you, loaded with information. I can tell you're a spiritual soul, and you care a lot about people, and that comes across. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for this opportunity. I wrote My Pretty Baby because I hoped that it would be a guidebook for others, and I do want it to be a call to action so that we can have these conversations without shame. And thank you so much for creating this opportunity and giving My Pretty Baby a voice.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. My name is Billy Dees, and you can find the Billy Dees podcast anywhere you find podcasts. As a matter of fact, we've been around about 10 years now in this form, the show in this form, and very grateful to have that audience. Thank you so much for having us. As far as social media goes, I'm on most of them. I would have to say that X, the former Twitter, has worked out very well. Those two things, and podcasting and X, seem to go pretty well. It's a very trending platform. It's a very real-time platform, and it just lends itself very well. You can find me there at Billy Dees. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast today, and we will talk to you again very, very soon.
Thank you for listening to the Billy Dees podcast. Follow Billy Dees on X at Billy Dees for updates about the program.
Do you listen to music or audiobooks on streaming devices such as Sonos or Amazon speakers? How about on your car sound system? If you use Spotify, Audible, or Amazon Music on any of these systems, you can also listen to the Billy D's podcast the same way. Billy and his team go the extra mile to make sure our podcasts sound as good or better than anything on the radio. Listening to the Billy D's podcast has never been easier. You literally just have to ask.